American politics provides plenty of us and them storylines that can serve to highlight our high-stakes democracy. Washington, D.C. provides the backdrop for careers that display the privilege of the insider and the outsider's stinging defeat of loss. Cassidy Hutchinson knows both. She rose to work in the Chief of Staff's office during the Donald Trump administration, a loyal staffer dedicated to the former president. But her stunning testimony to the January 6th committee presented an intimate portrait of an erratic president, a failed effort to stay in power, and detailed the chaos behind the closed doors of the White House. To me, Cassidy Hutchinson is something of a superhero. A young person facing decisions that many people 3 times her age would struggle with. A profile in courage at a time when that seems scarce in the political arena. Cassidy's memoir about her time in the White House is called Enough. After reading it, I'll confess I was a little nervous for this interview. There's something extra this time. Or gravity. Cassidy's running late. There's traffic.
Not so great car ride.
Okay.
I am not a morning
Still,
person,
when she arrives,
but I
she
have
comes
some
in
hope for
fast
this morning.
and warm, almost like she's going in for a hug. We shake hands, and I notice all her note cards.
You got your note cards.
She's highly organized and has apparently been thinking about prep for this interview, too.
I've been very nervous about preparing for this. I want to make sure I do this well.
Oh, good. That
so.
makes 2 of us. I just want to say this
This
right
is
now.
a very important constituency to me, so I
Well,
want to
well,
make
I'm just wondering, based on all that you've been through, has it changed your overall sense of the terms us and them?
Yes and no. I guess on a surface level, I was raised to be very self-sufficient.
Yeah.
So the way that I feel like my worldview was curated was more of it's you versus yourself. You're the only person that stands in your way. And as I've grown older, I've obviously realized there is more to it than that. Going through this entire experience, though, I think there's so much more that unites us than divides us. Yeah. But unfortunately, we're in this kind of calamitous political era where it is unfortunately us versus them. And I don't really love to put people into demographics because I think the more that we can unite people, the more that we can get through this period in American history. But there are people on both sides of the aisle. There are people on the far left and on the far right who will never be able to make that consensus to be able to meet people in the middle. And it's trying to curate this conversation so we can have a more united America again.
From West Virginia Public Broadcasting and PRX, this is Us and Them, the show that tells the stories about the things that divide us. I'm Trey Kay. Even though it feels like she's lived a lifetime in the last few years, 27-year-old Cassidy Hutchinson is still young. She tells me nearly everyone she meets compares her with their own children. And she says that she actually doesn't mind. I realize I've reflexively done the same thing. I have a son in his 20s. However, I'm genuinely honored to sit down with this woman whose experience is already shaping some of the most profound challenges of our time. Cassidy grew up in a poor working-class family, one that she says was largely apolitical. Still, she says there was kind of a paradoxical paranoia, especially from her father, a landscaper who worked hard to keep a roof over their heads. She remembers being really young, riding around with him, and any time he would see a police officer, he'd tell her, "You should never trust somebody with a government badge." Her family was what she describes as kind of isolationist, with a focus on self-sufficiency.
Neither of my parents graduated from high school, so I saw also the struggle sometimes that they encountered. The community I grew up in, well, it was on the wealthier side.
But did you feel that us and them dynamic, class dynamic in the town that you grew up in, New Jersey? Like the wealthy people and I guess the poor working class folks like you and your family?
Yeah, I could tell that there was a difference sometimes where I'd go to my friends' homes and I would be able to tell that they lived different than us. But it never really seemed like something of a disadvantage to me. I just knew it was different. I honestly liked that it was different. I liked that my family worked this way because I felt from a very young age that I had a different appreciation of my outlook on life.
And there was no envy for...
No envy on that part, I think. But I was able to recognize that there were differences. And I think that sort of, as a child, I felt a little bit displaced sometimes because of that.
So early on, you take a trip to Washington, D.C., and you had an immediate affinity for the place. What about it appealed to you?
With the hindsight that I have now, and this sounds so hokey, but the only thing I can really chalk it up to is almost a sense of premonition. We got to DC at night, and I remember seeing the skyline, and I immediately felt this draw to the city. Been to a few other cities, been to New York City several times, but there was something about DC that every time we would leave, I would cry and I would beg my mom, can we please move to DC? I just felt this sense of belonging, that this is where I needed to be. So from that point forward, throughout my childhood, my goal originally was to live in Washington, D.C. one day. I didn't really know why or what that was going to look like. But I felt this inexplicable draw and connection to Washington, D.C.
Well, you eventually moved on to college. You're the first in your family to go to college. How did your family react to your decision to attend college? And how did you see that role playing in your future?
When I was really young, I probably was 3 or 4. It's one of my earliest memories, but my father would say edumacation. It's really important that you get a good edumacation. After you graduate high school, you're going to go to college. You're not going to live like mommy and daddy. You have to go to college. So from a very early age, I didn't really know what college was, but it was implanted in my mind that, okay, you graduate high school, you go to college. Not only did I have that idea implanted in my mind that I had to go, but that also was my ticket out of the life. There was nothing wrong with the life that I had lived growing up, but I wanted different for myself. I didn't want to struggle the way that I had seen my parents struggle and interpreted their struggle as I grew older.
And it seemed as though from an early age you kind of had this idea of public service and wanting to work in government.
Correct. And that was for me, it was college was a means to achieve that.
What did your family think of your desire to seek a career in government, something that they, at least your father, didn't really trust?
Short answer, I don't really know. Overall supportive, especially from my mom, I would say. But at the same time, too, though, I think that my mom was apprehensive, not because of her still deeply rooted distrust in government, but I think that she did have that idea of the government where she was worried that I wouldn't be protected, and it was more of an elitist society that I wasn't a part of.
The first presidential race that grabbed Cassidy's attention was the Obama-Romney race in 2012. She was 12 or 13 years old and says she was immediately enamored. Most of her peers were Democrats, but she felt herself being pulled towards a more Republican ideology. Her introduction to Donald Trump was his personality as a businessman. Her dad was a fan of the reality TV show The Apprentice that Trump produced and starred in.
And he would say, I'm watching Donald Trump because I'm going to build a business like him. He's going to help me become rich. He is the man that's going to help save all of the businesses in America. So I had this idea of Donald Trump in my mind that he was this outsized figure that could fix everything. I wasn't necessarily enamored by Donald Trump, but I saw how he had inspired my father and how he had also infiltrated the lives of a lot of people that I had known, in some ways positive, some negative. It wasn't necessarily this universal, he wasn't this universal godlike figure in New Jersey, but, I did have this concept of him that he had achieved this great level of success.
So you're in college during the first election in 2016, and you're a government studies student, and you're looking at a career in public service. I'm curious, what did you think of candidate Donald Trump, and how he fit into your vision of politics and perhaps the Republican wing of politics?
Yeah, I realize that this answer isn't quite flattering, and I've received some flack for it, but it's the truth. I voted for Donald Trump in 2016. I strongly identified as a Republican until that point and to this day. But I also never thought that Donald Trump would actually win. And again, I don't say this with pride, but when I voted for Donald Trump in 2016, it was sort of more of a throwaway vote because I didn't want to vote for Hillary Clinton. But when I cast my vote for him, I was very proud to cast my vote for him. I was very proud to cast my vote in my first ever election. I just expected that it was going to be a landslide victory for Hillary Clinton. It wouldn't ever have to be something that we would worry about.
In her sophomore year, Cassidy applied for internships in the office of every single House Republican. She accepted a position with then Majority Whip Steve Scalise. There, she got the opportunity to meet members of the House Republican Conference, which set up for her next career move. So she worked with Representative Scalise and then Senator Ted Cruz, and at the same time, she's getting to know Kevin McCarthy and Mark Meadows and others.
I went home after my first night and I made flashcards for all of the members. On the front were their faces, and on the back were just some basic biographical facts, like their name, their districts, what was important to their districts, their family. So I always had something to talk to somebody about.
And I don't want to embarrass you right now, but you have cards.
It's here. A little embarrassing.
You have cards set up here. You are somebody who really prepares, right? Yeah.
Failure to prepare is preparing to fail.
So you get a job within the Office of Legislative Affairs, and that led to your moving into the White House?
Correct. The following summer, I applied for the House OLA internship, Legislative Affairs, got that internship, and then when I graduated college, there was an opening in that office, which was essentially a member services position. Some people have said to me, and I understand where they're coming from, but it has bothered me at points. It shouldn't have been someone like you. People that normally get those jobs are the people whose parents are big donors, and right. And I understand and I concur, and there were a lot of people that I worked with that was the case. And there was a stroke of luck and I would never deny that, but I did work really, really hard to get into those positions.
At some point, Mark Meadows is tapped by President Trump as his fourth chief of staff.
Mm-hmm. Fourth in 4 years.
Fourth in 4 years. And you take on the position to be his chief, the chief. How do we say that? You're the chief of staff. The chief of staff.
That's probably how it's best described. Yeah. Yes, I had several different titles in that position, although all fairly ambiguous. It's probably best described as Mark would describe it. I was his eyes and ears. I had an outsized role that my title didn't necessarily match, but I had the authority to carry out a lot of the things just because I had Mark's grace and I had Mark's trust. I saw myself working for the chief of staff, working for the office of the presidency, and to be able to leverage that and to provide as sound of counsel as I possibly could to make sure that he was doing his job well. That's how I tried to leverage that position. Now, as I grew into that role, I felt myself becoming more loyal to him as an individual, and that's where I did lose myself. And there were times that I was conscious of that, but I also tried to bury that because it was a truth that I didn't really want to admit to myself at the time.
There's a scene in the book where you describe meeting several of Trump's insiders, I think his family, and I can't remember exactly where this setting was, but you met the president a few times, but at some point he sees you there and he kind of says, hey, are we all in the inner circle here? And he wanted to make sure before he started talking that he wanted to make sure that everybody here was in the inner circle and loyal. Mm-hmm. How did that moment feel?
I didn't often write down my experiences in the administration just because there was sort of a level of paranoia in the administration about too much record keeping. But I did write down that night because it was sort of a surreal moment for me on several levels. It was a moment at Camp David, and the vice president was there. Several of Mr. Trump's children were there. Many of his senior advisors. On one hand, at that point and in no point after did I ever really feel that I was part of the inner circle. And the only reason I say that is because I knew in my job that everybody was disposable. So I felt that if I didn't keep that wall up and if I had gotten too comfortable, I would potentially lose the ability to make sound decisions, and I would get just too comfortable in that role, if that makes any sense.
Sure.
But on the other hand, I knew that I was trustworthy. I knew that I was there to work for him because I felt at the time that he was working on behalf of the American people. So it was, on one hand, it was an honor that I was there with him, but it was sort of a validation in a way that not only he, but the staffers around him and his family saw that the people that were there that day were trustworthy, and they trusted us with his life and his presidency.
How much was loyalty discussed, the culture of loyalty?
Very frequently.
It was? Yeah.
Yes. I now have the benefit of hindsight because I've had a lot of time to reflect, and a lot of that is because I did end up writing the book. But I look at things very differently now, but there was a big emphasis placed on loyalty, continuing to prove your loyalty, and also making sure that you're always watching your back.
I'm interested in what you're saying about that there in some ways was a paranoia. And yet there were two incidents that attracted me in your book. One of them was that you prepared a binder for Mark Meadows, proposing an initiative that President Bill Clinton had tried before, which was to have President Trump take claim for some bipartisan initiatives that had been successful, and that this might be a way of forging some bipartisan support. And then there was another time where you had been asked to convene weekly calls between the president and senior administrative officials and bipartisan Congress members to discuss COVID developments. And you had made a list of people in Congress, people who you knew very well from your time in Congress. Some were moderate Republicans, some were left-leaning Democrats. And you showed those to Mark Meadows, and Mark Meadows said, let's take off the moderate Republicans and the Democrats, the left-leaning folks. And he said, you can go and show this to the president. And before you did that, you talked to Kevin McCarthy, and he said, put those names back on. And then you show those to the president, and the president goes for that. Those two scenes got me, because here you are, 24, 25. I'm not exactly sure.
23 at the time.
23 at the time. That in many ways, a young person like you has so much influence in what the president is seeing. But also, I am kind of taken by your inclination for suggesting bipartisan initiatives. And I'm curious, how did that go over in the White House?
Sometimes, I think we do a disservice to our nation and to our own political system when we automatically rule out working with people on the opposite side of the aisle, because that's when good policy is made. As a nation, we're not set up necessarily to be a two-party system, but our founding fathers were intelligent enough to be able to predict that's what would come of our system. And I think it's a strong benefit of the American Constitution, because we generate the best ideas when we can work together to come to a consensus on things. And that's something that I really strived for. And to be fair to Mr. Trump, he didn't completely always rule that out. But at the same time, there was a big push internally in the administration to only curate our policies to the conservative base, which I didn't think was necessarily productive, because there was this large swath of voters that we needed to channel, and that only comes through bipartisan consensus.
After a break, Cassidy Hutchinson talks about her experience on January 6th and after. You're listening to Us and Them. This program is supported in part by the West Virginia Humanities Council and the CRC Foundation.
In difficult times, music gives us peace, brings us together, and helps heal us. It calms our nerves and brightens our days. That's why we're bringing you classic episodes of Mountain Stage on air and in our podcast. This is Larry Gross, host of Mountain Stage. Find something that's familiar or brand new and feel the power of live music on our website, mountainstage.org.
Hey, it's Trey, and this is Us and Them from PRX and West Virginia Public Broadcasting. Cassidy Hutchinson is perhaps best known for her scathing testimony to the January 6th committee. There, and in a memoir recently released called Enough, she chronicles her unlikely path to the Trump White House. Her front row seat to the events on January 6th ultimately led Cassidy to question the actions of the power brokers in the administration. But that January day in 2021 started out with a call from her mom.
Your mom's calling you saying, please don't go to work, but you go to work. What was going through your mind as you start hearing about rioters going to the Capitol and storming the barricades?
A lot of stress and anxiety, a feeling of a lack of control, wanting to be able to do something, but knowing I didn't really have the power to be able to do something. I describe it sort of as like watching a bad car accident that's about to happen or is happening, and you want to be able to stop it, or you just want to tell the person to slam on their brakes, but it's too late and there's nothing you can do to stop it. Yeah. What happened that day is an atrocity, and it's a stain on American democracy, and that day should never be forgotten for a multitude of reasons. But more than anything, too, it speaks to Donald Trump's character, who, Donald Trump has showed us time and time again who he is. I am guilty of not accepting that, but I think it is imperative to the future and the welfare of our democracy that we believe him when he tells us who he is. We believe him when he shows us who he is. And he, that day, showed us to be a man who cares more about his own pride and his own ego and making sure that he stays in power and not looking like a loser.
Well, the days after January 6th, you still continued on in your service in the White House. You were apparently vocal to other people about that you thought it was a travesty. How did that play over with your colleagues?
There were some people that would quietly agree with me, but at the same time, too, I was very vocal about how it was the president's fault and how we all were complicit in that. But at the same time, I could have resigned and I didn't. To identify as a Republican but not a Trump Republican is a very lonely place to be. And I was in that place for a long time. And it was, in a way, a lot easier to not make the hard break that Liz Cheney and so many of my former colleagues and members of Congress had, which is the more courageous thing to do.
What did it feel like being on the other side when you were no longer on the inside, when you decided that you were going to speak out against the president, that you were going to step out of the ranks of the rest of your colleagues in the White House?
In a lot of ways, I felt ready and I felt empowered to do so. And I felt a sense of peace. I was nervous. I could predict the attacks that would happen on me, regrettably, because I had been part of curating the attacks on other people before as well.
You'd been a part of that.
Correct. So I knew it was coming for me, but, in some ways I was afraid for my safety. I was more afraid for my family's safety because I knew that I didn't have the assets or resources to protect them. But as afraid as I was at points, sometimes fear never subsides and you have to do something afraid. But I think about how fortunate I was And then I think about that in comparison to other everyday Americans like Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss,
Sure.
who have had attacks unleashed on them by the former president. I think of Rusty Bowers, who was cornered in his home while his daughter was passing away because the president unleashed the mob on him because he wouldn't vote to certify the election for him. I think about members of the January 6th committee who had to travel with security details because they were uncovering the truth about what happened and how the president was single-handedly responsible for what happened on January 6th. So, there have been so many Americans who haven't been as fortunate as I was and am. And, we've entered this stage, an era in the United States where this political violence is not only tolerated, but in many ways it's encouraged. Not only is that dangerous, but that's not how we're supposed to live.
Our show originates from West Virginia, and that's a state that overwhelmingly supported President Trump in 2016 and 2020. And he still commands a great deal of support in the Mountain State and in the surrounding Appalachian region. And in your book and in your interviews, you say that you want to see that Donald Trump is never elected to the office again. And I'm just wondering, what part of your story, the Cassidy Hutchinson story that comes from blue-collar working America, what part of that do you hope might resonate with many blue-collar West Virginians and Appalachians?
I'm not going to try to equate my life directly to the lives of West Virginians, but I can personally relate. But I also have been on the other side. I have been in the political system, so I've been part of both worlds. And what I think is so important for West Virginians to understand really are two things. When it comes time to vote, they're looking at the ticket, and if the ticket is Joe Biden or Donald Trump, maybe inflation was lower when Donald Trump was president, but also think about what Joe Biden has accomplished. He has made strides to improving West Virginia's infrastructure, and he would continue doing so. But on a greater scale, too, this next election, to me, is bigger than the political divide. This next election comes down to voting for a candidate that is either going to support and sustain our democracy or a candidate that very well could destroy democracy in the next 4 years. I believe that the American people deserve a better option than Donald Trump. I believe that the American people deserve a candidate that could adequately represent them. That way we're actually looking at an election where it's Joe Biden and a potential Republican nominee that is there to sustain and support the American system and the American way of life. And any outlet or any way that I can connect with people to help them increase voter turnout, to shed light on the dangers of Donald Trump, I see this as a continuation of my public service. I believe that this is a duty that I continue to owe to the American people.
In Cassidy's story, two bookends really stand out to me. The first is the moment she really felt drawn to President Trump. She was at a rally to mark his 100th day in office.
I'm standing in the arena, and we're on the floor, probably 30 feet behind the main stage. I remember just taking a second and looking around and seeing people's faces. There were a lot of people that actually had tears in their eyes. And, it was that moment for me that I felt so compelled and so drawn to him. And it wasn't policy. I remember looking around at all of these people's faces, and they were people that I felt like I recognized, not because I knew them, but because I grew up around people like them, and because I saw how they felt connected to him. And I wanted to give him that support because I saw how people felt helped and they felt enamored in his presence. But then I think about the last Trump rally I went to during the 2020 campaign. And at that point, I'm very much in the inner circle. So within not even 3 years, I went from being a complete outsider to traveling on Air Force One with the president almost everywhere he went. And I'm at the last rally. It was in Wisconsin. And I just sort of took a moment to myself and I just started walking around, weaving in and out of all the supporters. And in the moment, I think it was more like I wanted to take that moment in. I'm looking around at all of these people, much like the people who were at the 100th Day rally in Harrisburg, my first Trump rally. And I caught myself thinking, these people are being duped. These people are being lied to, and like they're looking at him with so much hope and faith in their eyes. And I caught myself thinking that, and I just sort of like snapped myself out of it. I felt like I was completely caught between two worlds when I really didn't have reason to feel that way. You know, I probably could have been more forthcoming about where I came from, and I didn't hide it, nor did I lie about it. And I didn't try to put on some facade that I came from some super wealthy background, but I just didn't talk about my upbringing that much and how I could relate to the people there more than I could relate to many of my colleagues. But I am where I am now, and I am here with you now because I have had these experiences, and I think it's important to be able to have the hindsight and to be able to reflect on that. But, you know, I think that's sort of the magic and the allure of Donald Trump, but it's also the greatest fault is that he has been able to put on this facade as being there for the people, and that he wants to be president to serve these people when he wants to run for president to serve his own selfish ends. Donald Trump cares more about authoritarian rule than he does about our rule of law. You know, he has masterfully been able to loop in and create this base of supporters, many of them first-time voters, very hardworking American people, and he's exploited their resources by proliferating lies. Most of Donald Trump's campaign donations are small dollar donations from people in the great state of West Virginia who don't make a lot of money but believe in him and believe that he is there to support him, when he's using that money to fund his legal bill so he can run for president again. And that's not how the office of the presidency was designed to be. And I feel a very deep sense of duty to continue talking about this. You know, there are other candidates out there that want to support this very important constituency. You know, America's built off of these people's backs, and it's important that we take care of them in that way.
Cassidy Hutchinson, it's been a great pleasure meeting you, and I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I wish you the very best in the future.
Thank you, and thank you for having me, and thank you to your listeners too. I hope you all were able to take something away from this.
You've been listening to Us and Them. Our team for this episode was me, Trey Kay, Tasha A.F. Limley, Matthew Hancock, and Kate Smith. And additional thanks to Kellen Quigley, Kennedy Wright, and the nice folks at WAMU for letting us use their studio. Michael Lipton, Tristam Lozow, and Ahmed Solomon wrote and performed the Us and Them show music. Mark Lerner designed our logo. The marvelous people at PRX and West Virginia Public Broadcasting make Us and Them possible. So do grants from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the West Virginia Humanities Council, and the CRC Foundation. Hey, we'd love to hear your thoughts about this episode. Would you share them with us on our Facebook page or on X, which is formerly known as Twitter, at Us Them Podcast. Us and Them was originally developed with assistance from the mentorship program at AIR, the Association of Independents in Radio. We'll see you next time on Us and Them.
Support for this podcast comes from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
From PRX.